Welcome back to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We're starting on Chapter 3. On this particular Thursday, something was moving quietly through the ionosphere many miles above the surface of the planet. Several somethings, in fact, several dozen huge, yellow, chunky, slab-like somethings. Huge as office blocks, silent as birds, they soared with ease, basking in electromagnetic rays from the star's soul, biding their time, grouping, preparing. The planet beneath them was almost perfectly oblivious of their presence, which was just how they wanted it for the moment. The huge yellow somethings went unnoticeably at Goonele. They passed over Cape Canaveral without a blip. Woomerals and Jodrell Bank looked straight through them, which was a pity because it was exactly the sort of things they'd been looking for all these years. The only place they'd registered at all was on a small black device called a sub-ether sensomatic, which winked away quietly to itself. It nestled in the darkness inside a leather satchel which Ford Perfect habitually wore slung around his neck. The contents of Ford Perfect satchels were quite interesting, in fact, and would have made any Earth physicist's eyes pop out of his head, which is why he always concealed them by keeping a couple of dog-eared scripts for plays he pretended he was auditioning for stuffed in the top. Besides, the sub-ether sensomatic, in the scripts he had an electronic thumb, a short, squat black rod, smooth and matte, with a couple of flat switches and dials at one end. He also had a device which looked rather like a largish electronic calculator. It had about 100 tiny flat press buttons, and a screen about 4 inches square on which any one of 1,000,000 pages could be summoned at a moment's notice. It looked insanely complicated, and this was one of the reasons why the snug plastic cover over it fitted into had the words "Don't Panic" printed on in large, friendly letters. The other reason that the device was in fact the most remarkable book of all books ever to come out of the great publishing corporations of Ursa Minor, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The reason why it was published in the form of a micro-sub-meson electronic component is that if it were printed in normal book form, an interstellar hitchhiker would require several inconveniently large buildings to carry it around in. Besides that, in Ford Perfect's satchel were a few biros, a notepad, and a largest bath towel from Marks and Spencer's. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy has a few things to say on the subject of towels. A towel, it says, is about the most massively useful thing an interstellar hitchhiker can have. Partly, it has great practical value. You can wrap it around you for warmth as you bound across the cold moons of Jagelin Beta. You can lie on it on the brilliant marble-sanded beaches of Sagittarius V, inhaling the heavenly sea vapors. You can sleep under it, beneath the stars which shine so redly on the desert world of Kakrafoon. Use it to sail a mini-raft down the slow, heavy river Moth. Wet it for use in hand-to-hand combat. Wrap it around your head to warm off noxious fumes, or avoid the gaze of a ravenous, bug-bladdered beast of trail. Mind-bogglingly stupid animal. It assumes that if you can't see it, it can't see you. Daft as a brush, but very, very ravenous. You can wave your towel in emergency as a distress signal. Of course, dry yourself off with it if it still seems clean enough. More importantly, a towel has immense psychological value. For some reason, if a Strag being a non-hitchhiker, discovers that a hitchhiker has a towel with him, he will automatically assume that he is also in the possession of a toothbrush, face flannel, soap, tin of biscuits, flask, compass, mask, map, ball of string, gnat spray, wet weather gear, spacesuit, etc., etc. Furthermore, the Strag will then happily lead the hitchhiker any of these or a dozen other items that the hitchhiker might have accidentally have lost. What the Strag will think is that any man who can hike the lengths and breadths of the galaxy, rough it, slum it, struggle against terrible odds, win through, and still know where his towel is clearly a man to be reckoned with. Hence, a phrase which has passed into hitchhiking slang, as in, "Hey, you sass that hoopy Ford Perfect. There's a fruit who really knows where his towel is." Sass means to know, or to be aware of. Meets Hoopy means really together guy. Frood, really amazing together guy. Nestling quietly on top of the towel in Ford's perfect satchel, the sub-ethnosymptomatic began to wink more quickly. Miles above the surface of the planet, a huge yellow subdigs began to fan out. At Jodrell Bank, someone decided it was time for a nice, relaxing cup of tea. "You've got a towel with you," said Ford, suddenly to Arthur. Arthur, struggling through his third pint, looks round at him. "Why, what? No, should I have?" He had given up being surprised. There didn't seem to be any point any longer. Ford clicked his tongue in irritation. "Drink up," he urged. At that moment, the dull sound of a rumbling crash from outside filtered through the low murmur of the pub. Through the sound of the jukebox, through the sound of the man next to Ford hiccuping over the whiskey Ford had eventually bought him. Arthur choked on his beer, leapt to his feet. "What's that?" he yelped. "Don't worry," said Ford. "They haven't started yet." "Thank God for that," said Arthur, and then relaxed. "It's probably just your house being knocked down," said Ford, downing his last pint. "What?" shouted Arthur. Suddenly Ford's spell was broken. Arthur looked wildly around him and ran to the window. "My God, they're knocking my house down. What the hell am I doing in the pub, Ford?" "It hardly makes any difference at this stage," said Ford. "Let them have their fun." "Fun!" yelped Arthur. "Fun!" He quickly checked out the window again. They were talking about the same thing. "Damn, they're fun," he said, and ran into the pub, furiously waving a nearly empty beer glass. He made no friends at all in this pub that lunchtime. "Stop, you vandals, you homewreckers," bawled Arthur. "You half-crazed Visigoths, stop, will you?" Ford would have gone after him. Ford would have to go after him. Turning quickly to the barman, he asked for 4 packets of peanuts. "There you are, sir," said the barman, slapping the packets on the bar. 28 pence, if you'll be so kind." Ford was very kind. He gave the barman another 5-pound note and told him to keep the change. The barman looked at it and then looked at Ford. He suddenly shivered and experienced a momentary sensation that he didn't understand, because no one on earth had ever experienced it before. In moments of great stress, every life form that exists gives out a tiny subliminal signal. This signal simply communicates an exact and almost pathetic sense of how far that being is from the place of his birth. On Earth, it is never possible to be further than 16,000 miles from your birthplace, which isn't very far. So much signals are too minute to be noticed. Ford Perfect was at this moment under great stress, and he was born 600 light years away, in the near vicinity of Beetlejuice. The barman reeled for a moment, hit by a shocking, incomprehensible sense of distance. He didn't know what it meant, but he looked at Ford Perfect with a new sense of respect, almost awe. "Are you serious, sir?" he said, in a small whisper, which had the effect of silencing the pub. "You think the world's going to end?" "Yes," said Ford, "but this afternoon?" Ford had recovered himself. He was at his flippiest. "Yes," he said gaily. "In less than 2 minutes, I would estimate." The barman couldn't believe the estimation he was having, but he couldn't believe the sensation he had just had either. "Isn't there anything we can do about it, then?" he said. "No, nothing," said Ford, stuffing the peanuts into his pockets. Someone in the hushed bar suddenly laughed ravenously at how stupid everyone had become. The man sitting next to Ford was a bit soused by now. His eyes wavered their way up to Ford. "I thought," he said, "that if the world was going to end, we were meant to lie down or put a paper bag over our head or something." "If you'd like, yes," said Ford. "That's what they told us in the army," said the man, and his eyes began a long trek back towards his whiskey. "Will that help?" says the barman. "No," said Ford, and gave him a friendly smile. "Excuse me," he said, "I've got to go." With a wave, he left. The pub was silent for a moment longer, and then, embarrassingly enough, the man with the raucous laughter did it again. The girl he had dragged along to the pub with him had grown to loathe him dearly over the last hour, and it would probably have been a great satisfaction to her to know that in a minute and a half or so he would suddenly evaporate into a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. However, when that moment comes, she too would be busy evaporating herself to notice it. The barman checked his throat. He heard himself say, "Last orders, please." The huge yellow machines began to sink downwards and to move faster. Ford knew they were there. This wasn't the way he had wanted it. Running up the lane, Arthur had nearly reached his house. He didn't notice how cold it had suddenly become. He didn't notice the wind. He didn't notice a sudden irritational squall of rain. He didn't notice anything but the caterpillar bulldozers crawling over the rubble that had been his home. "You barbarians," he yelled. "I'll sue the council for every penny you've got. I'll have you hung, drawn, and quartered, and whipped, and boiled, until you've had enough." Ford was running after him very fast, very, very fast. "And then I will do it again," yelled Arthur. "And when I've finished, I will take all the little bits, and I will jump on them." Arthur didn't notice that the men were running from the bulldozers. He didn't notice that Mr. Prother, who was